I'm sure you're eager to start writing your own CSS. At this point, our website just looks very plain. However, it will be much easier for us to learn how to use CSS if we get a little bit of background first. CSS is an initialism that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. The style sheet portion of this term is obvious. It just means a document that describes the visual look of a web page. The cascading portion of this term is the important lesson here. Each CSS rule has the potential to override or cancel out previous rules. Let's take a look at a simple example. I'm going to add some style tags to our HTML. We'll delete these later on and use an external style sheet instead. This is just for the purposes of this example. So inside of my head, just after the line for normalize.css, I'm going to open up some style tags, and inside I'm going to type the element selector footer, open up some curly braces, and inside I'm going to type the color property followed by the value green. So if you're following along, go ahead and type that in. And we'll go over each part of the syntax momentarily, but for now, all you need to know is that this piece of CSS code will change the color of our footer text to green. So let's go ahead and save this, open up our preview, refresh the page, and we'll scroll down to the bottom. And as you can see, the text here in our footer is now green. Now, let's go back to our code, and right underneath, let's add another piece of CSS, and we'll select our footer again, and we'll do the same thing, only this time, we'll set the text color to orange. Now we have two CSS rules, one right after another. The first one changes the paragraph text to green, and the second one changes the paragraph text to orange. So then, will the text be green because, after all, that's the first rule that we applied? Or will the text be orange? Let's refresh and find out. So I'm going to go back here to my preview, refresh the page, and as you can see, our footer text is now orange. That's because the second rule has overridden the first rule because it comes later on in the code. Maybe this seems obvious, but as we code up lots of CSS, it's very important to keep this fundamental cascading rule set in mind. Sometimes it can cause strange problems that are very difficult to resolve. But if you're very careful about understanding how your CSS cascades, then it will be much easier. In fact, as we build our project, there will be many instances where we use the cascading nature of CSS to our advantage. We've already discussed the syntax of CSS in previous videos, but it's important that the syntax becomes second nature to you. So let's review it again. Now, I'm going to remove this second rule and just focus on one rule at a time. This entire piece of code, the element selector, the property, the value, the curly braces, all of this is called a rule. We will create many CSS rules in our project. The first portion of this rule that says footer is called a selector because it tells the browser which element on the page we want to apply our styling to. This particular selector is called an element selector because it's selecting based on the name of the element. And in this case, our element is named footer. There are many other types of selectors that can narrow down our styling to more specific parts of the page. We'll learn about lots of selectors throughout the course of this project. Next are the curly braces, which encapsulate what kinds of styling we want to be applied to whatever has been selected in our selector. Inside of our curly braces, we have a line of CSS, and this entire line is called a declaration because we're basically declaring or saying that we want some kind of styling applied. A CSS rule could include multiple declarations, but in this case we have just one. The first part of the declaration, right here, is called a property. In this case, we're using the color property, which changes the color of text. After the property is a colon, and then a value, followed by a semicolon, which ends the declaration. The value in this case is green, and once again, you can go ahead and hover over a color in Workspaces to see a preview of what that color looks like. So let's review backwards. We have a property and value pair here, which makes a declaration. We can have several of these declarations that live inside of these curly braces. The curly braces encapsulate which declarations should be applied to the selector. All of that stuff together is called a rule. As we use these terms in practice, they'll become more familiar to you. This is important because it will be easier for you to listen and discuss with other designers and developers. Let's try a few more examples before we jump into a quiz. Let's jump inside of our rule here and add another declaration that will change the background color. This is different from the text color, and we'll need to use another CSS property. So let's try it out. I'm going to use the background color property, and you'll notice that once again, Workspaces uses code completion to suggest a property to us. And then it also uses code completion to suggest a value. However, there are other values other than the ones listed here that we can type. I'm going to change our background color to orange, and then I'm going to change the text color to white. Now, of course, our web page has a white background, so in order to see the text, we'll need a separate background color like we've done here. Now, let's go ahead and save and refresh our preview here. And down at the bottom, you can see that we now have an orange background color for the entirety of the footer, which spans the entire width of the page, and then the text color is now white. But what if we wanted to apply this to another element instead of the footer? Let's say that this is what we wanted our navigation to look like. Well, we could go back to our code and change the selector from footer to nav, because we have our nav element further down the page right here. So let's go ahead and save, go back to our preview, and scroll to the top. And when we refresh the page, you can see that this styling has now been applied to our navigation and has been removed from our footer. Now the background color is orange, but as you can see, the links are still the default color that the browser has applied. So any links that have already been clicked are purple, and any links that have not been clicked are blue. So why didn't this text change to white? Well, this is a problem that's called selector specificity. In this case, the browser is applying a default selector that's slightly more specific than ours. We're just saying that we want to apply this to the navigation, but the browser has gotten more specific and styled the anchor tags. So we need to, in turn, get even more specific than the browser to describe what we mean here. So let's go ahead and jump back into our code, and let's modify this selector into what's called a descendant selector. We want to specifically select the anchor elements that are inside of the nav. So here we have nav, then an unordered list, a list item, and then an anchor element. However, we don't need to include these other elements. We can just jump straight down to the anchor from our nav. So what does that look like? Well, we have our nav here that's already selected. And right now this is an element selector. To make this a descendant selector, we follow up nav with a space and then type A. So this looks very similar to our element selector, but now this is a new selector that will select the anchor elements inside of our nav. So it's going down the tree here in our HTML from nav down to anchor. So let's go ahead and save the page and refresh here to see what this looks like. As you can see, our styling has now been applied to the individual links inside of our navigation. So no longer is the nav element what's being styled here. We're actually selecting the specific anchor elements. So the nav background has now defaulted back to white, but our nav links now have that orange background and the white text color. All right, I think we've done enough practice exercises to get us started. We're ready to jump into coding the CSS for our project.